بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي لا معبود إلا سواه ولا مخلوق إلا إياه نحمده في جميع أموره ونستعينه على رعاية حقوقه والصلاة والسلام على رسول الأنام خاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين وآله الطيبين الطاهرين محمد وآله أجمعين الذين لا يفترقون عن الحق إلى يوم القيامة. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Let me begin by asking everyone, all the sisters as well as the brothers, to cooperate and keep the children at least occupied and give me, for the English lecture, not more than half an hour. And if you are bilingual, then I will switch the channel. You have to listen to Farsi. Then give me another extra half an hour. Sisters that are sitting in the back, may I remind you that I would stop if I hear voices coming from the wilderness. To recap on some of the issues that I covered last night, I reminded the audience that Islam, right from the beginning of its inception, considered itself to be the last message, and also considered the messenger to be the last messenger. This is why there is a reference to Khatamul Anbiya. It also reminded at least the first converts, the early community, that the life of the Holy Prophet is not going to be forever. The messenger will die. إِنَّكَ مَيِّتٌ وَإِنَّهُمْ مَيِّتُونَ. This posed what I called an existential question. In the light of all these factors, what did the Prophet himself and the faith planned for this faith and the community after his demise? There were three propositions that I briefly stated last night, and I explained that the first and the second really are meaningless. And the first one was that the Prophet, despite knowing sisters, sometimes I wonder, there is an etiquette missing within the Muslim community. I have been to synagogues with nearly 350 families, sitting there, 45 minutes of lecture, not a single voice. I have been to churches with the QA that happened to be after my presentation. The lecture lasted for nearly an hour and 15 minutes. Out of respect for the speaker and the respect for the whole lecture, nobody said anything. We seem to look at the mosques and the gathering here as a place to tell stories. Let me be frank. I know you feel depressed or deprived inside the house for not being able to communicate with friends. But you can hold the conversation a little bit until I finish. So, please, sisters, give me half an hour for English and another half an hour for Farsi, and I would leave you in peace. You can have the rest of the night and as long a conversation that you want to have as possible. I'm grateful. The first proposition was that the Holy Prophet of Islam, despite knowing about the danger inside and out, really did not do anything about it. Metaphorically, I used the concept of a CEO and a company, and I said, put yourself in that position. If you have worked hard enough to establish a company, and you intend that company to continue behind you, are you going to forget about the future of the company or plan something for it? It's simply irrational for a universal a religion that claims universality and says that it's going to stay till the end of life, not to have a plan that comes after. And please, may I remind the brothers this time, as well as the sisters, to turn the cell phones off. Nothing will happen during this 10-15 minutes or an hour of conversation if you have a business or a yacht outside. Nothing is going to sink. So just turn it off for a while, and then when we finish you can turn it on. Alhamdulillah, now there are messaging, texts and everything else that the phone will keep it ready for you to entertain yourself after. The second proposition was that the Holy Prophet knew about and was concerned and conscious about what happens after him, but it left it to the community to decide for itself. I said even this proposition doesn't make sense in the light of the clan structure and the hierarchical structure that existed before Islam in Arabian Peninsula. The leadership was top down. There was nothing about consultation, shura, or debate or anything else. The head of the clan decided, everybody else followed. So the notion that the Holy Prophet suddenly brings in some new, let's call it, political philosophy into the whole game, but without educating the community for it, it's very hard to swallow. The only thing which is left is for the leader of the community, who assumed everything, all the positions, to make an effort to at least appoint someone capable of leading the community like himself. That's the third proposition. Once, unfortunately, and this was done in Ghadir Khum, if we look at the life of the Prophet immediately before his death and immediately after, we see that the Holy Prophet was trying to do everything possible to create something, a document that call it a constitution, a document that will be used by the Muslim community to clearly define the concept of leadership after himself. This is why he says, bring me a piece of paper and a pen, let me write it down. While the Holy Prophet was trying to do this, his own plan, the counter-revolutionaries had their own plan and their own opinion. And they did not allow this to happen, to the point where they disrespected the Holy Prophet by calling him senile. إِنَّ الرَّجُلَ لَيَهْجُرُ. So the question is, what happened after the death of the Holy Prophet? And I mentioned this last night. I have asked, rabbis, I have asked Christian ministers to try to understand whether it is my Shia, call it partiality towards this, that I find it very hard to swallow, or is it irrational? I've asked, I said, if we imagine that for the sake of argument, Jesus died in front of you, the body is laid in the house, and there are a few people trying to organize and deal with the body, would you entertain leaving the body and going somewhere else, deciding about who takes over after his death? I'm yet to have one single positive answer. The fact that this happened in Islam, and immediately those who, what I call it the white revolution, let's put it this way, that it wasn't that white after all, they took over and immediately tried to dismantle the old order in which Ahlul Bayt played a major role and marginalized them. This clearly indicates that there was a plan. We see immediately Fadak is taken from Fatima al-Zahra. Fadak, leaving this notion of the grand understanding of it, at least on economic basis, would have created economic independence for the group that are going to be led by Ali. And the new administration, the new government, immediately took that issue out. Burned the house, marginalized Ahlul Bayt to the point that disqualified Ali and his sons, despite all the narrations about how grand he is. إِنِّي تَارِكٌ فِيكُمُ الثَّقَلَيْنِ كِتَابُ اللَّهِ وَعِتْرَتِي. Both ahadith exist in books of Ahl Sunnah and Ahl Shia. Kitabullah wa itrati and Kitabullah wa sunnati. And they are inseparable from haqq and justice until they come back to me on the Day of Judgment. But the new government that had a totally different policy. If we look at Nahj al-Balagha, khutbah Shaqiyya, which is, I believe, the third khutbah in Nahj al-Balagha, clearly defines that how Ali felt about the new regime. Starts, أَمَا وَاللَّهِ لَقَدْ تَقَصَّمَهَا فُلَانٌ. He's not even prepared to say Abu Bakr. لَقَدْ تَقَصَّمَهَا فُلَانٌ وَإِنَّهُ لَيَعْلَمُ أَنَّ مَحَلِّي مِنْهَا مَحَلَّ الْقُطْبِ مِنَ الرَّحْمِ. Be aware, by Allah, the son of Abu Quhafa, which is Abu Bakr, dressed himself with it, with the Khilafah, and he knew fully well that I was entitled to it much better than he was. In relation to the Holy Prophet, the flood flows down from me to the community, not from the community to me. I put a curtain against the Khilafah and kept myself detached from it. I began to think whether I should assault. These are the two hard choices. Should I stand up and take what is mine by right, but risking damaging Islam? Or, for the time being, bite the bullet, wait to protect Islam until Islam becomes strong, and then I have to wait and see what happens next. And that is the path that he chose. فَرَأَيْتُ إِنَّ الصَّبْرَ عَلَى هَاتَا أَحْجَرُ. To wait is much more prudent. فَصَبَرْتُ. I waited. And it was as if I was being suffocated, or a thorn in one's eyes, when you see that the new regime systematically dismantles everything that the Holy Prophet has already created in Muslim community, step by step by step. One of the byproduct of the Saqifa and the coming to power of the Khalifs is the departure of what we call justice from the community. If we look at verses in the Holy Quran, clearly defines that justice constitutes the foundation of every faith. Every messenger that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sent, and the essence of the message is so that people work together to establish justice. Surah Al-Hadid, verse number 25. لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلَنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ وَأَنزَلْنَا مَعَهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْمِيزَانَ لِيَقُومُ النَّاسَ بِالْقِسْطِ. Indeed, we have sent our messengers, and with them came the book and the framework, so that people establish justice. And we have another hadith from the Holy Prophet that says, كَادَ الْفَقْرَ أَنْ يَكُونَ كُفْرًا. The absence of even what we call economic justice, which is one factor from the total holistic justice. The absence of economic justice destabilizes the place or the community to the point that the establishment of Tawheed and belief in the Almighty Allah becomes impossible. This is the first thing that was sacrificed in Islam as a consequence of illiterate, ill-equipped, unqualified leaders coming to power and internal drift starting. Social life that the Holy Prophet worked so hard to establish harmony and create what is called a shift in consciousness was turned around. If we look at the methodology or the policy of the Holy Prophet when it comes to dealing with the pre-Islamic culture, there are part of their culture that he found them to be totally abhorrent, and as such, eradicated. Idol worshipping and the concept of Tawheed is not, they are mutually exclusive. This is why the first opportunity that the Holy Prophet comes to Mecca, the house of God has to be cleaned of all the images beyond anything else but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He took some of these cultural habits that existed in pre-Islamic life and social life that he did not found them to be abhorrent, but you needed to modify them a little bit. And what he did, took the inner, the content of these cultures out and created a new kind of culture within it, or the new practice and ideas to put into the same culture. We have in Hajj and everything else. What the Saqifa, consequence of Saqifa was, I mean, how many of you have heard about this terminology, the reverse engineering? Chinese do it. Alhamdulillah, Iranians are doing it. Other people are doing it. You take a piece of mechanical equipment, you take it apart, and then you assemble them again together, again and again, until you learn in and out of the whole thing, and you mass produce it. What happened after Saqifa, it was a reverse engineering of what the Prophet did. Why? Because the Prophet took cultural, pre-existing culture before Islam and devoided them of the content and put a divinely based, God-centric content in it. What they did, they took prayer, fasting, Hajj, which were part of the Muslim culture, devoided them of the spirit of Islam and put something else in it. The society that was supposed to be based on social justice became corrupt, hierarchical, racist, oppressive, etc., etc. And this was done gradually under different pretexts. When you marginalize Ahlul Bayt, and you see the three-pronged attack, marginalize Ahlul Bayt. Number two, annihilate and systematically wipe out those who could become a threat to the new order. Right from the beginning, Abu Bakr sends his chief of the army, Khalid ibn Walid, to kill one of the leaders of the Muslim community because he said, I do not recognize the new Khalif, and I'm not paying zakat and homage to this. Why? Because there are others who are much more qualified than you are. These are people that say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, the basic of Islam. And Khalid ibn Walid goes, wipes these people out, take the entire female community as booty that comes back to Medina, and nobody stands up to say, on what basis you do that? No wonder in these days, Shias go to Saudi Arabia, and on a broad daylight, Saudis, Salafis, Wahhabis, Takfiris come to them and they say, we will kill you because you are kafir, and we will take all your possessions as booties. This is the narrative of the early history. History has repeated itself. While during the prophets, people knew exactly that the road to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala requires self-denial, captivity, exile, pain, endless danger, and even firing squad and assassination if it requires. But comfort came in, and very quickly society became self-centered, oppressive, racist, dogmatic, and corrupt. The second Khalif starts the process by first dividing, while the Holy Prophet divided all the income from Baytul Mal equally between all the Muslim community, irrespective of whether they were black, white, yellow, green, Sayyid, non-Sayyid, Arab, Ajam. The first thing that comes, the Khalif says, non-Arabs cannot come to Medina during the Friday prayer. They have to stay out and come in other days. Second, the distribution of wealth is unequal distribution. You give to the Arabs more than to non-Arabs. Even within the Arabs, there are priorities or criteria. Those who are within Quraysh, you give them more from the others that they are not. This gradual process leads to the point when Uthman beats Ibn Mas'ud up until he is conscious for disobeying his order to give 100,000 pieces of gold from Baytul Mal to whom? To Marwan ibn al-Hakam. This is the guy that the Holy Prophet exiled from Medina as an existential danger to the life of Muslims. Under such circumstance, we have to look at the revolution of Imam Hussein. Hussein represents humanity's eternal struggle to liberate itself, for liberation, salvation, protection, and perfection. He is the symbol of the fight against tyranny, corruption, and sets a standard. This is what we call, when the hadith says, كل يوم عاشوراء وكل أرض كربلاء. it takes the message, encapsulates it, and gives it to the new future generation. That in this conflict between haqq and batil, corruption, justice and injustice, there is a standard, a modality that we can follow. And by the way, we have examples in our contemporary life. Wherever there is a struggle for liberation, Hussein is present. We've seen it in Lebanon, we've seen it in Iraq against the resistance, against the American occupation. We see it in other countries. That the liberators, those who want to liberate themselves from the occupation and the oppression and tyranny, the first thing that they call is the name of Hussein. Hussein sets a paradigm, a new paradigm in life. Wherever and whenever people stand up and refuse to submit to despotism and prefer death to a dehumanized, purposeless life, Hussein stands with them shoulder to shoulder. This is a symbol. In our contemporary life, the occupation wasn't worried about us going to the mosque and praying. Could go. Because that mosque, going to the mosque and praying that accepts the occupation, is devoid of that justice, the spirit of justice that is necessary in Islam. Sets two examples. This morning, last night I said it as well. Hussein sets two examples for us. Two different types of Islam. Islam of Bani Umayyah and Islam of Abu Dhar. Islam that stands for justice and equality, and Islam that stands for dogmatism and oppression. Islam that says, because you disagree with me, I have the right to wipe you out. The Takfiris, the Wahhabis, the Salafis. An Islam that says we can agree to disagree. In the absence of direct access to divine knowledge, we have multiplicity of opinions. This is the essence of Ashura, that I believe, I intend to use this on the last night, I believe the last lecture is Friday night, to unpack this and say, where can we take this message? And what language or methodological approach we can take to take the message to the community that has very little in common with us beyond the fact that we live in the same area. Part of the social structure. Inshallah, if we have a chance. I said that every time I give the lecture in English, I would like to take 10 minutes of answering questions. I would like to remind the audience, on Thursday afternoon, after the Dhuhr and Asr prayer, we are going to have close between 2 to 3 hours of open QAs. So don't panic if your question was not answered. I have to work within the time constraint. But I collect all these questions, and on the day of Ashura, I intend to address them within some kind of a broad group and categories. So the night before, I started with the sisters, with the brothers. Last night I started with the sisters, and I said, if you have any questions. Now I'm going, for the sake of balance, not equality, for the sake of balance, going back to the brothers. So we have 10 minutes. If sisters can have a few questions and the brothers can have a few questions, at least I can address one from each community within 10 minutes. You have to write your question, please.
Oh, okay, I will give you the paper. Sorry.
Is there an air conditioning in this place? It's becoming
آقای
really
شاهیان
hot.
این حال هم پکر گرفتن میتونین از اینجا بیارین که اینجا بیرون بانه حالا میتونین هم بیارین حالا بیرون کسی میخواه که سوال کنه؟
توضیح بفرمایید که سوال کسی داره.
جواب میگه نزدیکی وقت است
Well, could we have another question from the brothers so that I can balance these two? Do we have one question from the brothers? Well, let's get back to where we ended and have some silence, please.
Okay.
And that applies to the brothers as well. If you could refrain from conversation for the next half an hour, I'd be great. Sisters, well, just leave them down here, because I can only answer one or two questions. And I already have two. Let's start. Going back to when Islam, I think I need the person who asked the question to explain exactly what is, because the reverse certain aspect of the native culture and reconstruct them with Islam at its core. What are some examples of that? I don't know whose question is it. Could you explain exactly what you mean?
Earlier when you mentioned that in the beginning,
Stand up.
earlier in the beginning when you mentioned some certain parts of the culture that were reverse engineered or reconstructed, and certain parts that weren't considered abhorrent were changed a little bit to have, Islam as part of them. What are some examples of those parts of the culture?
Well, I gave one example, and that was, for example, there are three different types of cultural habits that the Holy Prophet faced with. Some or few that were totally abhorrent, and Islam could not accept. Monotheistic understanding of the divine with polytheistic understanding, they don't go together. Idol worshipping and tawheed, they don't go together. That was unacceptable totally. So this had to be rejected completely. There were some issues that culturally was acceptable, but it needed little bit of modification. The concept of the code of dress, for example, was that code of dress, that it built on the existing code of dress that existed in pre-Arabia and developed it further. And there are some other cultures, that's enough. Maybe I have more than enough. I'm not going to answer all these questions. Okay. There are some other cultural things. For example, the relational, individual relational and respect for the family, etc., etc., the bondage that existed in Islam used it. As a matter of fact, if we go back to Medina, and what is loosely defined in the constitutional movement as the Constitution of Medina, in which it brought Aus, Khazraj, the two tribes of Medina, with the Jews, combined them together as one community that had similar goals and objectives, this clearly builds on similar cultures that existed. So these three different categories, one you reject completely because it's unacceptable totally, one modify a little bit, one accept and build on. So these are the three. Going to a question from the sisters. In the Musibas, we hear that when Imam Hussein was killed, the sky turned red and there was an earthquake. Did these events actually occur, or are they purely metaphorical? My understanding, unless we, there is a kind of a way of addressing classical or biblical literature and dealing with them that at least in the West they call it the hermeneutical approach. Hermeneutical approach, which means going back to the source and trying to understand under what context and for what reason it was said. Unless we deal with that issue for the time being, I use it metaphorically. Nothing more, nothing less. It's simply, last night, similar question what I was asked, and I tried to explain that the challenge that we have sometimes is the issue itself, which becomes extremely difficult to deconstruct and simplify for ordinary people to understand, and sometimes is the limitation of language. That language itself is unable to deal with complicated and complex and particularly paradoxical issues. Hence, we use a language, or a particular language is used in tradition, and we have no alternative but at least to look at them. Once we understand their context, until we understand their context, my approach to these kind of ahadith is metaphorical approach. So I hope that clarifies this at this stage. And because irrespective of whether the sky rained blood or not, what does that do to us now? What is it that we should learn from the message of Ashura? How can we implement that message in our lives? These are the critical issues that we should focus on, not the narrative or the language that existed in what, or used to express a particular events or explain a particular event, or the reverence that people had for a particular events 1,300, 1,400 years ago. It's neither here nor there, irrespective of how we approach to resolve the issue. I will take these papers with me home. As I said, one day inshallah I'll have time to put them together in a book, but for the time being, Ashura, on Thursday afternoon we tried to spend 2-3 hours addressing these questions. And I'm going to read the question as I did in other mosques and say the brother or the sister who has read the question, who has posed the question, is he or she around or not? If they tell me that person is not around, I'm not going to answer it. Deal with another question. So if you want your question to be answered, please come back here on Thursday afternoon.